Helen Carter finished another quiet workday and returned to her apartment in Columbus, Ohio later than usual. At this stage of her life, she preferred evenings without interruptions, no unnecessary conversations, no noise, no surprises. Just a simple dinner, a few minutes of stillness, and the comfort of knowing that everything in her home remained exactly where it should be. The stairwell smelled faintly of fresh paint. Someone in the building had decided the railings needed updating, and the work was still new enough to linger in the air. Helen climbed to the 5th floor, unlocked her door, and switched on the light in the entryway. She paused for a moment, listening. The apartment was quiet. Michael had left 2 days earlier on a short business trip. 3 days, he had said. A neighboring city. Nothing about his tone suggested excitement or irritation. Just the calm, practical voice Helen had grown accustomed to over the years. There had been no reason to question it. She took off her coat, hung it neatly in the closet, set her bag on the console, and walked into the kitchen. The kettle clicked on. As the water heated, Helen stood by the window, watching a few neighbors talk near the benches below. Ordinary conversations about ordinary things. The kind of evening that felt predictable, even reassuring. Her phone rang without warning. The number was unfamiliar but local. Helen answered with polite caution. A woman's voice came through the line, steady, professional. "Good evening. May I speak with Helen Carter?" "This is Helen," she replied. The caller introduced herself as Olivia Harris, a senior manager at a bank branch on East Broad Street. Helen listened, mildly puzzled but not yet alarmed. Then the tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Carter, please don't be alarmed," the woman said. "But we need to clarify a situation. We've reviewed our records and security footage. We've determined that the woman who came to the branch earlier today was not you. At this moment, your husband is here with another woman who closely resembles you." Helen felt the words arrive before their meaning did. "That's impossible," she said. "My husband is on a business trip." There was a brief pause on the line. "That's why I'm calling," the woman replied calmly. "We need you to come to the branch immediately." Helen ended the call and stood still for a moment, the phone heavy in her hand. Then she opened her messages and found the last text from Michael. Short, neutral, sent an hour earlier. "Everything's fine. I'm in meetings." She called him. The line rang longer than usual. Then voicemail. Helen tried again. This time the call was rejected, abruptly, deliberately. She stared at the screen until it went dark, a thin pressure building behind her eyes. Michael was never unreachable. Not like this. She moved quickly, almost mechanically. Coat on. Buttons misaligned. She noticed, stopped. Fixed them with fingers that trembled despite her effort to stay calm. Passport, wallet, keys. The order mattered. She needed to stay precise. Careless mistakes felt dangerous now. Outside, the air was damp. A taxi pulled up within minutes. Helen slid into the back seat and gave the address quietly, asking the driver to hurry, but carefully. He nodded and merged into traffic. The city moved as it always did. Traffic lights changed. Pedestrians crossed streets carrying groceries, backpacks, coffee cups. Store windows reflected the glow of evening. Everything looked intact, unchanged, almost indifferent. The normalcy made the tension inside her sharper. Her thoughts drifted backward, assembling details she had ignored. Michael asking whether she carried her card with her, whether she remembered the app password, whether the account access still worked on her phone. At the time, she had answered without concern. In their marriage, responsibilities were divided. He handled large payments. She managed daily expenses. It had seemed efficient, sensible. Now, those questions replayed themselves differently. But the deepest unease did not come from the thought of money. It came from something more personal, more invasive. The idea of another woman sitting somewhere, answering questions in her name. signing as her, smiling with a version of her face, as if her identity were something that could be borrowed, worn, returned. The taxi slowed as it approached the bank. Glass doors reflected the streetlights, bright and ordinary. Helen felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. Whatever she was about to see inside would not be undone. Her life, as she understood it, was already shifting. The bank was quieter than Helen expected. The evening rush had passed, leaving only a few people near the ATMs and the low hum of overhead lights. A security guard looked up as she entered, his attention sharpening the moment she gave her name. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and gestured for her to follow. They moved past the customer area toward the interior of the branch. Helen's steps slowed without her meaning to. Then she saw him. Michael stood near one of the desks, his back half turned. He was wearing the jacket he had taken on his supposed business trip. The sight of it landed with a dull physical weight. For a brief second, she wondered if exhaustion was distorting her vision, and then she saw the woman beside him. At first glance, the resemblance was striking. Similar hair color, worn at nearly the same length, a comparable build. Even the way she stood, one shoulder slightly forward, head tilted as if listening carefully, mirrored Helen's own posture. It wasn't an exact copy. Up close, the differences would have been obvious. But from a distance, in passing, it was enough. Enough to confuse. Enough to convince. The precision of it was what unsettled her most. Michael turned and noticed Helen. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, fear, calculation. Then it disappeared. His expression settled into something neutral, almost casual. "Helen," he said, as if they had run into each other unexpectedly. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer. Her gaze moved between him and the woman beside him. The woman smiled faintly, uncertainly, as though unsure which role she was supposed to play. Her hands clasped together in front of her, then dropped to her sides. Before Michael could say anything else, a woman in a tailored blazer approached them. Her manner was composed, her voice steady. "Helen Carter?" she asked. Helen nodded. "My name is Olivia Harris," the woman said. "Thank you for coming in so quickly. If you don't mind, I'd like to take you to a private room so we can complete an identity verification." Michael stepped forward, his voice sharpening. "There's been a mistake. We're just here on business. This doesn't need to turn into something dramatic." Olivia did not argue. She didn't raise her voice or challenge him. She simply turned her attention back to Helen. "It will only take a few minutes," she said. "Then we can address everything else." Helen followed her down the corridor without looking back. Somewhere behind her, she felt Michael hesitate. As the door to the small conference room closed, one thought became unmistakably clear. This was not a misunderstanding. The conference room was small and plain, furnished with a round table and 4 chairs. The door closed softly behind them, shutting out the rest of the branch. Helen sat down and placed her ID on the table without being asked. Her movements were steady, deliberate. Olivia Harris took a seat across from her and opened a tablet. Her tone remained calm, professional, carefully measured. "Thank you for coming in so quickly," she said. "I'll explain exactly what happened." Helen listened without interrupting. Earlier that evening, Olivia explained, a woman had entered the branch accompanied by Helen's husband. The woman identified herself as Helen Carter. She presented documents that appeared legitimate at first glance. Her appearance matched closely enough to pass the initial visual verification. Nothing raised concern during the first few minutes. Then the details began to matter. When documents were prepared for signature, the handwriting did not fully match the signature on file. The difference was subtle, but noticeable to a trained eye. During routine security questions, the woman hesitated and answered several incorrectly. Not dramatically wrong, just enough to suggest unfamiliarity. Because of that, the transaction required additional verification. At that point, Olivia said, we paused the process and reviewed our records more closely. We also checked internal security footage. That's when we realized the person presenting herself as you was not, in fact, you. Helen swallowed. Olivia continued, still composed. The transaction they attempted involved 2 actions. The first was opening a new credit line in your name. The second was a partial withdrawal from your savings account. Helen's fingers tightened briefly against the edge of the table. I did not authorize any of that, she said. I understand, Olivia replied. That's why we contacted you immediately. Helen confirmed again that she had not given consent, had not signed any documents, and had not granted power of attorney or permission to act on her behalf. Olivia documented each response carefully. Several forms were placed in front of Helen. She read them, signed where indicated, and verified her identity through additional internal procedures. A photo was taken for confirmation. Everything was handled efficiently, without urgency or raised voices. The attempted activity has been blocked, Olivia said once the paperwork was complete. We've flagged the situation as suspected identity fraud. No funds were released. No credit was issued. Helen nodded. The room remained quiet for a moment after the words settled. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No damage had been done. And yet, the weight of what nearly happened pressed heavily against her chest. Helen agreed to speak with Michael before leaving the bank. Olivia Harris stepped out of the room, closing the door behind her, leaving them alone with the quiet hum of the building. Michael didn't sit right away. He stood near the table, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, as if that small barrier could steady him. You're taking this the wrong way, he said quickly. You don't understand what was happening. Helen remained seated. She said nothing. Michael exhaled sharply and began talking faster, his words overlapping. He explained that it was about money, about timing, about needing to move quickly. The apartment needed repairs, he said. Things had piled up. He wanted to solve it efficiently, without stress, without dragging her into details she didn't need to worry about. I was going to fix it and tell you afterward, he said. There was no point in upsetting you first. Helen watched him closely. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. Michael hesitated, then admitted what he had been circling around. His credit history wasn't strong anymore. An old loan still lingered on his record. Almost paid off, but technically still there. Enough to complicate approval. Enough to slow things down. Yours is clean, he said. That's all. That's why it had to be in your name. Helen nodded once, slowly. So you decided not to tell me, she said. Her voice was steady. Because I would ask questions. Michael shifted his weight. You always do. And then everything turns into a discussion. I didn't have time for that. Helen let the silence stretch between them. The explanation settled into place, fitting too neatly to be accidental. She looked at him and asked a single question. Why my name? Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes flicked away, just for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its certainty. Because it would work, he said. Because it was the easiest way. The words confirmed what Helen already knew. This wasn't panic. It wasn't a desperate mistake made under pressure. It was a plan. Thought through. Prepared. And the business trip? She asked. Michael waved a hand, irritation creeping into his tone. That wasn't important. I didn't want to explain everything. Helen stood. In that instant, the last fragile assumption she had been holding onto disappeared. There had been no emergency. No misunderstanding. The trip had been a lie. Helen left the conference room and walked toward the exit without looking back. The air inside the branch felt heavier now, as if the space itself had absorbed what had just been said. Near the front desk, the other woman stood alone. Helen, she said quietly. I'm sorry. Helen stopped and turned. Up close, the resemblance was less convincing. The similarities remained, but the illusion no longer held. The woman looked younger, mid-30s perhaps, and nervous in a way Helen recognized immediately. Fear without direction. "My name is Rachel," the woman said. "I didn't know it would go like this." Helen studied her face, then asked calmly, "What exactly were you told?" Rachel hesitated, then spoke quickly, as if afraid she might lose the chance. Michael had told her that Helen was aware of everything, that she had agreed, that this was only a formality to speed things up. Nothing illegal, nothing serious. "He said you didn't want to deal with paperwork," Rachel added, "that you trusted him." Helen nodded slowly. The pieces aligned with an uncomfortable precision. Michael had offered each of them a different version of the truth, shaped to fit what he needed them to believe. "You understand," Helen said evenly, "that you could be charged with fraud." Rachel's eyes widened. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't think about it that way. I've done things like this before. Not exactly this, but similar." She paused. "He said it was safe." Helen felt no anger rise in her chest, only a quiet clarity. "It isn't," she said, "and it won't be. If you do it again." Rachel nodded again, faster this time, her hands shaking slightly at her sides. "I won't," she said. "I swear." Helen didn't respond. She turned and walked back toward Olivia Harris. At Helen's request, they completed additional safeguards immediately. Cards were canceled and reissued. Account passwords were changed. Access through shared devices was restricted. Alerts were added. Each step restored a small measure of control. Olivia worked efficiently, without commentary. When everything was finished, she looked up. "You acted in time," she said. "That matters." Helen thanked her and stood to leave. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she noticed something had shifted. The shock remained. The hurt was still there, but the sense of helplessness was gone. Back at the apartment, Helen did not turn on the television. She did not start dinner. The familiar routines felt misplaced, almost inappropriate. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and began to write. She recorded the time of the bank's call, the name of the branch manager, the exact words she remembered hearing. She noted when Michael failed to answer, when the call was rejected, when the bank confirmed the attempted transaction. She wrote without emotion, carefully, as if precision itself were a form of protection. At her age, she understood a simple truth. Memory could blur under pressure. Paper did not. It was late when Michael finally came home. He didn't knock. He used his key, walked in with visible irritation, and stopped when he saw her sitting at the table. "You caused a scene," he said immediately. "You embarrassed me." Helen didn't look up. She finished a sentence, closed the notebook, and placed the pen beside it. "A scene was caused by bringing another woman to a bank and calling her your wife," she said calmly. Michael scoffed. He paced the kitchen, running a hand through his hair. He insisted nothing had actually happened. No money was taken. No loan approved. Everything was stopped in time. He said she was exaggerating, turning a technical issue into a catastrophe. "We could have handled this quietly," he said. "Now you've made it worse." Helen met his gaze. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I'll be back at the bank with a lawyer. I'll request full statements for every account for the past several months, and I'll ask them to document every attempt that involved my name." Michael froze. The change in his expression was immediate and unmistakable. The irritation drained from his face, replaced by something tighter, calculating, afraid. "You won't do that," he said, though the words lacked conviction. "I will," Helen replied, "because today I learned what you're capable of." Michael opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time that night, he had nothing ready to say. The silence between them felt unfamiliar and final. The apartment no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like contested ground. In that quiet, something essential cracked, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to make the damage impossible to ignore. The next morning, Helen left the apartment early. Michael was already gone, leaving behind a brief message saying he was at work. She didn't respond. The lawyer's office was quiet, understated, the kind of place where people spoke carefully and listened all the way through. The man who met with her was in his early 60s, calm and unhurried. He asked her to start from the beginning and did not interrupt as she spoke. Helen described the phone call from the bank, the taxi ride, the woman who looked like her, and Michael's explanation afterward. She avoided speculation and focused on facts. Dates, times, names, documents. When she finished, the lawyer nodded once. "The most important thing," he said, "is that you arrived before the transaction was completed. That protects you." He explained what the bank had already suggested. The situation qualified as attempted identity fraud. Not a misunderstanding, not a technical error, a coordinated effort to act in her name without consent. He also made one point clear. Cases like this rarely begin with a single attempt. Later that morning, Helen returned to the bank. Olivia Harris met her again, this time accompanied by a representative from the bank's security department. They reviewed internal records together. The pattern was unmistakable. Over the past 2 months, Michael had contacted the bank multiple times. He had asked about credit limits, about eligibility, about updating customer information. Each time, the process stalled because additional verification was required. Each time, he searched for another way around it. "This wasn't spontaneous," the security officer said evenly. "It was preparation." Helen felt the confirmation settle heavily, but cleanly. There was no shock left, only clarity. The bank explained her options. Without a formal statement, their response would remain limited to internal safeguards. With one, the attempted fraud could be officially documented, preventing future misuse and alerting other institutions if necessary. Helen signed the statement. She didn't do it out of anger. She didn't do it to punish Michael. She did it because she understood something fundamental now. Someone willing to use another person's identity once would likely try again. If not with her, then with someone else. When she left the bank, the day looked ordinary. People hurried past carrying coffee, phones, briefcases. Life moved forward without pause. Helen walked to her car with a folder under her arm and a steady awareness in her chest. She had acted in time, and she was no longer guessing. Helen had just stepped outside the bank when she heard her name. Michael was standing near the entrance, his posture tense, his expression caught somewhere between desperation and anger. He moved toward her quickly, lowering his voice as if the walls behind them could still hear. "Please," he said first, "let's talk. You didn't have to take it this far." Helen stopped at a distance that felt deliberate. She didn't invite him closer. Michael's tone softened. He said he had panicked, that he was overwhelmed, that he would fix everything if she gave him time. He promised repayment, promised change, promised that none of it had gone through anyway, so no real harm had been done. When she didn't respond, his voice shifted. "You're going to ruin me," he said. "You're acting like I committed some kind of crime." Helen looked at him steadily. "You brought a woman to a bank to act as me," she said. "That is a crime." Michael's face tightened. He glanced away, then back at her. The anger drained, replaced by something rawer. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "I'm in debt. More than you know. People are waiting to be paid. I thought I could close it quickly and then tell you afterward." "People?" Helen asked quietly. He didn't answer directly. He said there had been pressure, calls, deadlines. He admitted that Rachel had suggested the idea. She knew someone. She had done things like this before. He said it had seemed like the fastest solution. Helen understood then not just what he had done, but what he had intended. If the plan had worked, the debt would have been hers, her credit, her name, her responsibility. He would have walked away from the consequences, leaving her to carry them alone. "This isn't family," Helen said calmly. "Family doesn't work that way." Michael's eyes hardened. He straightened, trying to reclaim control. "You think you'll be fine without me?" he said sharply. "You'll end up alone. You always needed me more than you admit." Helen felt the words pass through her without impact. "I'll be fine," she said, "because I won't be living in fear of what you'll do next." She turned and walked away. Michael said something after her. She didn't register what it was. She didn't slow down. She didn't look back. For the first time since the phone call, her steps felt certain. Michael moved out a few days later. There were no raised voices, no final arguments, no attempts at reconciliation that lasted longer than a few hollow sentences. He packed his belongings quickly, with visible irritation rather than remorse. Before leaving, he said she would regret it. Helen did not respond. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt unfamiliar for a moment, too quiet, too still. Then the quiet settled into something else. Not relief exactly, but space. Helen spent the following days doing what needed to be done. She confirmed that her accounts were secure. She followed up with the bank to ensure the fraud alert remained active. She checked her credit report, reviewed every entry, and documented the legal steps already taken. Each action was practical, unemotional, necessary. She was not rebuilding her life. She was stabilizing it. Michael attempted to return once. He stood in the doorway, subdued, saying he understood now. That pressure had made him act irrationally, that he would never do anything like that again. Helen listened without interruption. When he finished, she told him calmly that understanding came too late. "I don't want to live wondering what you'll decide to do next," she said, "or whose name you'll use." There was nothing more to explain. After that, he stopped trying. Life did not transform dramatically. Helen continued going to work. She returned to her routines gradually, cooking simple meals, reading in the evenings, walking familiar streets. The difference was internal. She no longer checked her phone with unease. She no longer wondered whether silence meant safety or risk. The story did not end with celebration. No one applauded her choices. There was no sense of victory, no dramatic justice delivered in public. But there was stability. Helen remained in her apartment. She kept her name, her credit, her reputation, and her sense of control. Most importantly, she reclaimed the certainty that no one had the right to use her life as a solution to their own problems. Justice arrived quietly, and it arrived in time.